One of my very favorite books in the Bible is the Old Testament book of Job. And I invite you to turn to Job, the very first chapter. I like Job for lots of reasons. For one thing, many of you know that I like science, and keep in mind that Job is probably the oldest book in the Bible as far as its time of writing, back about the time of Abraham. And so in a time when the Romans believed the world was held up by a giant named Atlas, and when the nations that Job lived among, they believed the world was painted on the back of a giant elephant of a turtle that swam around in a cosmic sea held up by 4 elephants. And it is during that time that God looks down and asks Job and his friends, "Where were you when I framed the world, hung it on nothing?" He asked him about atmospheric pressure. He asked him about the hydrological cycle. He asked him about true star clusters, all kinds of things. Job didn't know what he was talking about, but God did. And so I like Job for that reason. But also, of course, Job is, according to our Savior, an example of patience under testing and trial when our faith is tested. And so I would like to read just enough of the beginning of the history of Job from this first chapter to get our minds in gear and then talk about some things. Because I do know that sometimes, let me just ask a question that is often asked me: why am I having such a hard time? Would you stand with me as we read together? Job chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God, and eschewed evil. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep, and 3,000 camels, and 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned, and cursed God in their hearts." Thus did Job continually. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, "Whence comest thou?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it." And the Lord said unto Satan, "Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the works of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face." And the Lord said unto Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in thy power. Only upon himself put not forth thine hand." So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. And there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger unto Job, and said, "The oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell upon them, and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee." While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, "The fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee." While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, "The Chaldeans made out 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee." While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, "Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee." Then Job arose, and rent his mantle, and shaved his head, and fell down upon the ground and worshipped, and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. I am delighted to have here a dear friend of mine, Bill Dolan. Bill, would you ask God's blessings on this message? Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, yes. Yes, God grant it. God grant it. Amen. You may be seated. Now, this message is not very well outlined or even arranged. It is just really put together as things occurred to me from experience. Did you ever have a bad day? I mean a really bad day. I mean a day when you felt like you'd been run over by a troop and a wall had fallen on you. Did you ever have a day like that? A day when nothing goes right, a day when you'd been better off to have stayed in bed. In fact, some of you look like maybe that's the kind of day you're having today. Well, I'm sure that you had. And what I would like to do is simply share with you some things I have learned about bad days and hard times just by living long enough to live through my share of them. So here goes. Points about bad days. Number one, everybody has some. Everybody has bad days. Abraham had them. He was the father of the faithful. David had them. He was the apple of God's eye. Elijah had them. Elisha had them. Peter, John, Luke had them. Paul had them. In fact, Paul tells us about one of them in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. He said, For we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our troubles, which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure, above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life. Would you let me paraphrase? He said, I thought I was going to die. And George Washington had them, and Abraham Lincoln had them, and everybody has them, and Job had them. And that's important, because I hear a lot of Christians by their testimonies and some by their preaching imply that Christians live a life that is free from such times. That a Christian's always on the mountaintop, never in the valley. Well, that's just not so. It's contrary to Scripture, it's contrary to experience, and it's contrary to the testimony of some of the greatest saints who have ever lived. You can join Brother Ike's blessing plan if you want to and get a blessed billfold and God give you victory in the lottery and success in love if you want to, but that's not the history of the Christians of Hebrews 11, the heroes of the faith. The Bible says, He who will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. Now, I know I've seen a few people that to all I could observe were on the mountaintop all the time, just shout and run and have a good time all the time. Could I tell you something very candidly about them? They aren't worth shooting. Careful now. I'm just convinced that anybody who tries to live for God in a wicked world, there are going to be times when our enemy, the devil, is going to jump on us. It just dumbfounds me when I see Christians say, why me? Why you? Because you're the child of God. You've got an enemy of the devil. You're a danger to the devil's purposes. Of course he's going to jump on you. He is the accuser of the brethren. He's trying to wear out the saints of God. He's your enemy. If you don't ever find yourself in conflict with the powers of darkness, you might want to start checking out where you are with the Lord. And this whole thing of why me, you want to start asking why me, the question that comes to my mind is, Why did God's grace ever reach an unworthy person like me? Why? I must tell you, and I'm not, in fact, the purpose of this message is to try to encourage people who may be struggling with whys. And so believe me, I am not in any way belittling. And part of it is my own personality and my own self-image and my own worldview. But I don't struggle with that. I struggle with plenty of things. But I just, unless my mind's playing real tricks on me, I've not struggled at all with why. People, if I got what I deserved, I'd have been in hell a long time ago. And anything less than hell is a mercy towards me. And I know it full well. And so I say over and over again, it is the natural, thank God, inclination of my heart. God, why are you so good to someone so unworthy as I? And yet there are those who would imply that the Christian is just on the mountaintop all the time. And I'm convinced it can be an additional source of discouragement to the struggling saint, when in the hour of trial we make them feel that they're going through hard times because there's something wrong with them. It's an awful thing to do to people. Job had hard times precisely because he was such a good man. Job went through hard times because God loved him and had confidence in him. So everybody has some. Which brings me to point 2. Inasmuch as everybody has them, there's really no need to go looking for them. You ever met people like that? I mean, people that aren't happy unless they're unhappy? No, I'm really serious. Some people apparently have teapot religion. They can't whistle unless they're in hot water up to their neck. I know preachers that I love and appreciate, and my position on things is pretty much what theirs is. I'd never have them come and hold me a meeting. They can stir up more snakes in a week than the poor preacher can beat out in a year with a stick. If you're on the mountaintop, enjoy every moment of it. Revel in it. Don't go looking for trouble. The devil will see you get your share. Some people are spiritual hypochondriacs. I've got an aunt that's one of those things. Bless her heart. I mean, she's a hypochondriac. She's died of every disease known to man. Some you ever heard of. I mean, I'm serious. I've heard her get up in church and request prayer because she had something that women can't even have. I'm sorry. I'm just telling you. I asked my uncle one time, how's my aunt? And he said, well, she was enjoying right poor health, but she'd been complaining lately of feeling better. I mean, don't fall into that mode, people. They will see you have your share of hard times. So don't go looking for them. Point number 3 of just general things as they occurred to me about bad days. Bad days, they are real. Someone in fun asked me around the fountain yesterday, said, I heard you are a Christian Scientist. I knew what they meant. We are not Christian Scientists, which is neither Christian nor scientific. When you hurt, you're hurt, and it is real. And whatever else God may be to us, He is real. He doesn't play word games. He doesn't ask you when you're hurting to pretend that you are not. Christianity is not whistling in the dark, or whistling in the graveyard, or putting on a happy face and pretending that it doesn't hurt when it does. Our God is real. He meets us where we are. Simply denying them will not make them unreal. Now, this does not mean, young people, that, I realize this is the camp meeting, not the youth, but I just have a heart for you young people, and you older folk know that we're all included too. But please, listen to me. This does not mean that we go around just, letting it all show when we're having a hard time. That's not hypocrisy. I get up and testify sometimes, and the devil, the moment I sit down, hops on my shoulder and says, you hypocrite. You got up and smiled real big and said, it's wonderful to be a Christian, and you're dying inside. I'm not a hypocrite. What I did was stand up and tell the truth. It is wonderful to be a Christian. I'm not telling you when I say that I'm feeling good. I'm not telling you that the bank account is full or that the car is running well. I'm telling you it's wonderful to be a Christian. And it's wonderful to be a Christian when everything's going well, but it's also wonderful to be a Christian when the bank account's flat and the car's skipping and the body's weak. It's just plain wonderful to be a Christian. It's always appropriate to testify. It's wonderful to be a Christian. And let me tell you right now, a bad day with Jesus is better than the best day the devil ever gave anybody. It's wonderful to be a Christian. Some people apparently have what I call the emperor's new clothes religion. You remember the story. You understand it isn't a Bible story. But you remember the emperor's new clothes. There was an emperor in a distant land, and that emperor had a problem. His problem was that he just lived to buy and try on and show off his wardrobe. He'd pretty well beggared the kingdom with his extravagance in his clothes. And some charlatans passing through that part of the country heard about the problem of the king and decided they'd turn it to a prophet. And so they presented themselves at the palace gate and explained that they had a magic yarn from which they could weave magic cloth and thus sew magic garments. And the magic was that those garments would be invisible to the eyes of anyone who was stupid and unfit for their position in life. And the king took the bait, and he had a room set up in the palace, and they set up a loom, and of course they simply went through the motions of weaving cloth, though there was really nothing there. And every now and then the king would send his page or an aide or maybe his fool to check on the progress of the garments. And they would go into the room, and the two charlatans would hold up nothing. How do you like it? To his horror, he saw precisely nothing. But he dared not admit that. That'd mean he was stupid and unfit for his position. And so he would go out to report that they were coming along fabulously, which simply would reinforce the lie in the hearing of others when they were sent in, thinking that they alone saw nothing. And finally the day came when the garments were done, and the king tried them on. And he saw them to be very beautiful. And then there came a day of a great parade down the main street of the kingdom, when the king would have a chance to show off his gorgeous new magic wardrobe. And all the people had been informed of the magic. And so as they lined the streets and the king goes by, they all ooh and awe and say, "Oh, what fabulous garments." And each one, hearing his neighbor say that, says, "Oh, ooh, oh, what fabulous gowns." Until a little child, in innocence, without guile, says, "But he doesn't have anything on." And I've watched that game play in church. Somebody gets up and by their testimony implies that while it's just you're always birdsong sunshine on the mountaintop all the time in the Christian life, and some new struggling saint who's struggling to hold on to God with their fingertips and everything's going wrong, and they hear that and they take one of two routes. They either despair and say, "Well, I must not have anything because that's not my testimony." Or they grit their teeth and say, "Bless God, if they're having a good time, so am I." And we simply reinforce the lie. You know I'm not suggesting we brag on the devil. It is always appropriate, as we said, to praise the Lord, but people, God is real, and He knows where we are, and He understands when we hurt. That was precisely part of the purpose of the incarnation, that Jesus Christ could empathize with us in our struggles and our hurt. Don't fall for the emperor's new clothes religion, nor for Dumbo the flying elephant religion, but I dare not take the time for that one. They are real. Holding on by faith, claiming the promises, all of which are biblical, is not some kind of magic. This is not open sesame. And God wants us always, and if you expect to progress in your Christian life, you must be honest. If your God asks you to play games with the truth, you've got the wrong God, sir. You can play that game for a while, but there will come a crisis somewhere out in your life, and if you have been less than transparent and honest and candid with God, it'll all come sliding forward to take you down. Claiming the promises of God is not putting on a smiley face and yelling happy slogans and hoping that'll make it get better. Years ago, when I was teaching at Hobe Sound Bible College in Hobe Sound, Florida, somebody gave me a yacht. It was a 14-foot flat-bottom aluminum boat, but it was a yacht to me. It had a 2.5 horsepower air-cooled outboard motor on it, but this was my yacht. And I decided to take my 4 teenage children and my wife and myself on a yachting. And so we went down to one of the canals and we launched my yacht. We put in the 4 teenage children, my wife, myself. We put in the new anchor that I had bought, the 2 picnic baskets, a picnic table, and 4 folding chairs. We put in the tackle boxes and the fishing poles. And then I got in, and when we did, we had about that much freeboard. But we started out of the canal, and if you know anything about Hobe Sound, the canals that come up into the campus can open out on the Indian River. That's salt water, rises and falls with the tide. You're separated from the open ocean by Jupiter Island. We turned south, and immediately we went under the drawbridge, and we were going to go down and find an isolated beach to have a picnic. Being the wise sea captain that I was, I knew that we were in a little bit of a precarious situation, and so I stayed in the shallows. Now, every now and then, though, I would meet a sure enough yacht coming up the Indian River, and they would leave a wake. And I discovered with the very first one that the only way that I could safely negotiate that wake was to turn and face directly into it and bob over it, because if it came alongside, the water joined us, and we couldn't afford much of that. Which means that after I'd get beyond the wake, I'd be a little bit farther out into the Indian River than I really wanted to be, and I would turn and scurry back to the shallows until the next yacht came by. We went a mile or so down the Indian River. We found a secluded beach. We went in and we unloaded and set up for a picnic. Meanwhile, my oldest son, Alan, and my youngest daughter, Karen, they decided to do some fishing while my wife was preparing sandwiches and so on. So they went out a ways, and Alan found a fishing hole and began to catch some, but the boat began to drift. And you know how you can hear sound over the water so well. I could hear them talking out there. And so he turns to his sister in the back of the boat and he says, "Throw out the new anchor." So she did. Unfortunately, she didn't tie the rope to the boat first, and so the anchor went over and the rope followed, and finally when the end of the rope went over, she looked in at me and went like this, and I went like, it was probably a godsend that we got rid of the weight of the anchor. But we called them in and we had a picnic, and then we loaded everything back up and we started back north. Of course, now we didn't weigh as much because we'd eaten some of the food, you see. And so now we're heading back north, and we're coming along with me staying in the shadows when we were almost at the drawbridge, just beyond which was the first canal and safety, when tragedy struck. Just north of Hobe Sound, Evinrude Outboard Engines has a testing and development facility. And suddenly down the Indian River came 2 giant black speedboats. Each of them had 2 giant black motors strapped on the back, 2 technicians sitting in there, one piloting, the other manning a bank of instruments to monitor the performance of the boats and motors, and they were flying low. And suddenly I had 2 very treacherous wakes to negotiate, and it turned out to be beyond my skills, and the water began to join us, and we were almost to the bridge, and I realized that if I was going to do anything, I would need to do it quickly. And so I gunned that mighty 2.5 horsepower motor, and and as we went under the bridge, my children are screaming, "We're going under! We're going under!" But the wise sea captain in the back was yelling, "No, we aren't! We're going through! No, we aren't! We're going through!" You know what? They were right. We were going under. In fact, we went under full throttle. I think the motor ran underwater for a few seconds. And so we came out from the other side of the bridge, just a row of heads going along with little wakes going back from our necks. We settled to the bottom. Everything began to bob up. I stood up and tried to grab something. I looked up at the bridge tender. He's shaking his head, looking down. People driving by on the bridge, looking down at us, yelling, "Campies! Campies!" And for some reason, my family seemed embarrassed by all of this. You know what I learned? I learned just yelling happy thoughts, yelling, "We're going through! We're going through!" Didn't change a thing. We were going under. People, God's solution to hard times is not simply yelling happy thoughts. It's 1,000,000 miles from that of getting a hold in faith on the promises of God and just standing around saying little happy sayings. God never, ever, ever plays games with the truth. And don't you either. Point number 4, in just general things about bad days as they occurred to me. They do not ever, 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 ever mean that God does not love you. They may not mean that God is in any way displeased with you. They may mean exactly the opposite, that God has confidence in you and that the enemy knows that you are a threat. That you are a threat to Satan, that God trusts you, that God is proud of you, that God is pruning you for better things. You remember? Verse 8 of our text. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job? That there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and doeth evil. That was God's opinion of Job. Perfect, upright, God-fearing man, a sin-avoiding man, a family man, a good man, a very rich man, an influential man, a praying man, a consistent man. You remember his friends at one time say, Behold, thou hast instructed many, and thou hast strengthened the weak hands. Thy words have upholden him that was fallen, and thou hast strengthened the feeble knees. This was one good man, people. And yet he went through loss and trials like you and I can hardly imagine. He had trouble. And Jesus refers to him as an example of patience. And I remind you that in spite of all that you may hear radio preachers say, the fact is that the trying of your faith worketh patience. You and I are not saved because we feel good. We are saved because we have cast ourselves upon the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ and a God who is faithful. And we have done so in faith, and that is a choice. Do we understand that? Do you know why some people have bad days? It's because they are trusting in themselves for their own salvation. And I don't care, unless you have been tragically misled, deep down in your gut, you know that you are not good enough to save yourself. Saved, sanctified, glorified, petrified, homogenized. The fact is that you know that you do not deserve to go to heaven. And we've done everything we're supposed to do. We are unprofitable servants. For by grace are ye saved, through faith. And that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Now, you know that we believe that the Christian works because he's saved, but we do not believe that we're saved because we work. Yes. The Scriptures go on to say, For we are his workmanship, created unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should do them. And anyone who claims to be a Christian and doesn't have a heart and mind set to do to the very best of their ability by the grace of God, the commandments and ordinances and works of the Lord, then you ought to be really alarmed about the genuineness of your experience. But you understand that ultimately you are not saved by works. You don't get saved by works. You don't stay saved by works. You don't ingratiate God to yourself by works. You aren't saved by works plus faith. You are saved by faith plus nothing. Now you're saved by a special kind of faith. You're saved by a faith that works. Remember James? Faith without works is dead, being alone. Yea, a man may say, Thou hast faith, I have works. Show me thy faith without thy works. And I will show thee my faith by my works. Thou believest that there is one God, thou doest well. The devils also believe and tremble. But wilt thou know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered his son upon the altar, and faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect or complete? And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Do you see then that by works a man is justified, and not by faith only? Now, if we had time to go into the original words there, it's not talking about saved by faith and works. It's talking about a faith that works. Likewise also was not Rahab the harlot justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. So I'm not teaching this saving and then just do anything. But I am saying as long as you have any thought in the back of your mind that you are helping God to save you by your works, you will never be totally confident. It is the sufficiency of His sacrifice. Now, saving faith includes absolutely the ingredient of obedience. But that's a million miles from this thing of, now that I am saved, I can just kind of do any which way. Here was a good man. The Bible says a perfect man. He's the first such man mentioned in the Bible, and that means a mature and blameless man. And he had hard times. Remember, point number 5, concerning bad days, they tend to follow hard on times of real spiritual growth and blessing. If God's been helping you in this meeting, it is, now I don't want you to go out there and some kind of take away the joy and the happiness because you're anticipating that the devil's going to contest the ground that you've gained, but it is wise for you to know that it is out there. The devil's not going to take this lying down. If God has helped you in this meeting, the devil's going to rise up and see if he can't knock you back down again. Remember, Job 1:9, then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for naught? Yeah, there was that bad day, but then there came this another bad day. In fact, they tend to come in bunches. It's not usually bad days, it's bad weeks. I remember one time my brother Leslie had been a fine Christian, but he had backslidden, he and his wife, and had been out of victory for some time, and I was concerned and praying for him. And so I was thrilled one day when the phone rang, and I was in Florida and he was in Kentucky, but the phone rang and he said, I just want you to know that Linda and I got back to the Lord tonight in revival. And it sounded so real and good, and I was so glad. And we talked for a while about the mercies of the Lord and His goodness and grace. But about a week, maybe 2 later, the phone rang again. I picked up the phone. It was my brother. He said, hi. I said, hi. He said, how you doing? I said, all right, how you doing? He said, okay. He said, how's the weather? I told him. It was obvious something wasn't quite right. And so I said, what's the matter? Oh, nothing. You still got the victory? Yeah. Well, what's going on? Well, he said, it's just been a bad day. And I just needed to call and talk to somebody. I said, well, if it'll help, tell me about it. And so he did. And this is what he said. He said, Albert, he said, you've been in our house? Yes. You remember the bedroom upstairs? Yes. You remember the closet in the bedroom? Yes. He said, well, in the back of that closet, there is a little door that you can open to crawl out onto the ceiling above the kitchen so that you can work on the electrical or the ductwork. I said, okay, if you say so. He said, remember that. He said, this was just one of those mornings. He said, I got up and I've been rejoicing ever since the Lord had saved Linda and I and brought us back into the fold, but said, I got up this morning and just did nothing, just felt flat. But he said, I got up and he said, I went into work, and he said the boss was in a bad mood. He said, I'm not a clock watcher, and he wasn't. He was the kind of man give 9 hours work for 8 hours pay. But he said it was terrible. He said nothing I did pleased him. Everything was wrong. I mean, he was on my head. He apparently had gotten up on the wrong side of the bed or something that he was. And he said, I began to find myself just watching the clock. If I could just somehow, and if I could hang in here till noon, I'd get a chance to at least get out of here for an hour and get away from it. And he said, finally it became noon, and he said, I went down to the hamburger place, and I got a hamburger and a milkshake, and he said, I stretched lunch out just as long as I could, but now I had to go back. And he said, I was riding up the elevator to my office when he said, I suddenly realized that something was wrong in my mouth, and he said, I got the feeling around with my tongue, and he said, apparently I had swallowed my partial plate. It went down with the milkshake. And he said, if anything, the boss was in worse shape than he was in the morning. Said he was on my head. And he said, I began to dream 5 o'clock. If I can hang in here till 5 o'clock. And he said, to just survive, I began to build air castles. Come 5 o'clock, I'd get in my pickup truck and I'd drive home. And I'd pull up in the carport. and I'd open the door from the carport into the kitchen, and the smell of supper cooking would waft out into my nostrils, and there would be Linda, and she would come, and she'd kiss me, and I'd go into the living room, and I'd sit down in the easy chair and get the newspaper, and the children would come in and crawl in my lap and huggle up close, and he said, that's the one thing kept me going, was just dreaming of 5 o'clock. But he said, meanwhile, back at the ranch, he said, little Douglas and Stacy, they found that little door in the back of the closet. And they opened the door, and they saw the light that came up around the handy box in the ceiling, around from the fluorescent fixture that's in the ceiling of the kitchen below. And with the curiosity of children, they began to climb across the framing for the ceiling to explore that light. And so that it was at that time that finally 5 o'clock came. He said, now in desperation, he ran out, jumped in his truck, peeled gravel, headed for his castle. Came sliding up in the carport, jumped out, opened the door to the kitchen. And at that precise moment, Douglas decided to stand on the little box in the ceiling. And so it was as he opened the door, he was greeted with an image of the light slowly departing from the ceiling, and a hole opening up in the ceiling, and his son riding the fluorescent light fixture in what almost seemed like slow motion down to the floor. Halfway down, the wires snapped loose and sparks went everywhere. Then the fluorescent tube hit the floor and exploded in a cloud of dust. He said his wife, who had her back to him at the kitchen sink, she swung around. Her hair stood on end, her eyes got this big, and she yelled, "Ah!" He said the boy is sitting on the light fixture looking up at him going, "Ah!" He said, I looked up through a hole in the ceiling. My little daughter's looking down going, "Ah!" He said, I closed the door and I went, "Ah!" He said, I've just had a bad day. I mean, he'd had a bunch of good days and the devil didn't like it. And I'm simply telling you that the devil will guarantee you some bad days. And if you have made progress in this meeting, the devil, I mean, that's the kind of devil he is. He will be on your head. You'll have times. It had nothing to do with your spirit. Have to do with your chemistry, the pressures of life, whatever it may be. But the devil will try to tell you that God has gone off and abandoned you. And if you have that kind of an image of God, you'll probably buy what the devil says, and you will be wrong. I mentioned that they come in bunches. I'm going to skip through some of this. You remember that there was another bad day. If you went to chapter 2 of Job, and you'll discover that here the devil comes back and even demands more. And so God gives him access even to Job's physical, so that Job is smitten with sore boils. That means boils on tops of boils. He sits in an ash heap and scrapes himself with potsherds to try to ease the suffering. He doesn't even have a dog named Moreover to lick his sores like the poor man in the New Testament. His wife says, why don't you curse God and die? His friends come and sit there and stare at him for a week. That'd drive anybody nuts. Then when they do speak, they say, Job, go ahead and admit it. You've done some horrible sin, or this wouldn't have happened to you. And it's been my experience. I don't really expect the world to understand. But it really hurts when the family of God doesn't understand and accuses you wrongly and tells you your motives were wrong. But Job's health is now damaged. And so I come to point 7, having doubled up that one that said that they follow hard on good days and they come in bunches. And that is this: bad days, they may flow from your humanity and not from carnality. Though the devil, of course, will accuse you. Now, I do feel I must tell you, when it comes to physical, some bad days could be avoided. I remember one time stopping by to see a family member that was a saint of God and was always upbeat and an encouragement. And I walked into her house, an older lady, and lo and behold, the house was dark. The windows were drawn, the curtains, and she was obviously very depressed. I'd never seen her that way before. I mean, it was just the end of everything. It was troubling. It was frightening to me. And I was trying to be upbeat, but she wasn't very receptive to it. I mean, it was just doom and gloom. And as I sat there on the couch, I kind of looked over at her coffee table, and here were magazines, and I realized what she was reading, and they were all these things. I mean, people, you know, I don't want anyone to ever be a blind optimist, but do you understand that God is really doing some wonderful things in this world? These are exciting times. God's doing some good times. I'm excited. I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged with you young men and women. I'm convinced some of the finest young men that we've ever had in the holiness movement are with us today. Some of the finest young preachers with their heads screwed on right and their heart fiery and committed to a careful walk with God, but a vision for the lost are amongst them. I'm encouraged. But I looked over, and all she was reading about was the Illuminati was taken over, and the witches were taken over, and the warlocks, and the communists, and the people. God is really still in control. I'm not asking you to be a blind optimist, but don't read all this negative stuff. You're giving the devil tools to beat you over the head with. When I say something could be avoided, I'm going to take the time for this one. I remember, when you talk about bad times, I remember I'd only been married about a year. I was still a young man, and I had a heart attack. I woke up in the middle of the night having this heart attack. And I sat up in bed, and I couldn't catch my breath. And my wife, I woke her, and she said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" I said, "I'm having a heart attack." She said, "Oh, heart attack?" "Yeah." She said, "You're only 21. I said, "I know, isn't it awful?" She said, you know, it doesn't run in your family. I said, "I know." She said, "Maybe it's something you ate." I said, "It couldn't be anything I ate. It didn't eat anything except that pickle and the cold spaghetti and that piece of pizza that was left over." And when I got to thinking about what I'd eaten before going to bed, it wasn't surprising I was having chest pains. It was surprising I wasn't dead. And my wife said, "Go back to sleep." Use some common sense. Get enough rest. There are times when the most religious thing you can do is give yourself some rest. When you get out there in the ministry, take a little vacation once in a while. Okay. Read some good news. Make sure you know the difference between being bothered and being burdened. Remember that, of course, when I say that it can be a physical problem and not a spiritual, though the devil, the old accuser of the brethren, will tell you it's a spiritual problem, it can simply be, it could be our inheritance. Do you know that? All of us were born with a certain dispositional inheritance. Some of us by nature are outgoing, and others are melancholy, and some are sanguine. I mean, we know that. And there are strengths and weaknesses to every one of those. And God, the God of infinite variety, has a place in His kingdom for every one of those to contribute. But it also means that some of us will have to especially work in certain areas of our lives. And so we have this inheritance. And even our parents can pass on to us certain phobias. I don't mean here, I'm not talking genetically. I'm talking about in our childhood and our youth. They can pass their fears and their shortcomings on to us, never meaning to. People, I have died with leprosy and cancer 1,000 times. My mama, who loved me, a wonderful lady, but I realized when I finally got old enough to understand things, she'd have rather died than damage me, but she had this awful fear of cancer, and she passed it on to me. And for years, every time I looked in the mirror, there was a bump or a lump or a pimple. It was leprosy or cancer or gangrene or mortification of the throat or something. It can be our heritage. It can be our inheritance. I remember one time after I was married, I went back home for a vacation. My brother was there, and we were going fishing early one morning, and so we got up very early to slip away at dawn, and lo and behold, a key piece of equipment we realized was still in my mother's closet in her bedroom. And so I slipped in very quietly to get it, but I could not help but notice that my mother, lying in this great big bed, was all curled up in a little tiny knot right up in the upper corner. And so that afternoon when we came back home, I said, "Mama, I had to slip into the bedroom and get something out of the closet, and I noticed that big comfortable bed, and you're all curled up in a tiny little knot way up in the corner. You look so uncomfortable." She said, "I always sleep like that." I said, "Well, why? You got to..." She said, "When we were little, when I was a child, we were poor, very poor." Said about 8 of us slept in the same bed. Said that bed had a huge hole in the mattress. And she said, I had to sleep curled around that hole. And she said, now the hole's gone, but the curl isn't. Now, I'm not talking about the bent towards sin, not talking, but people, some of us still have curls, in our understanding and our thinking that the devil will use to tell us that there's something wrong with us and that God doesn't love us and that it's sin. It can be our inheritance. It can be ignorance. Do you know that? There have been times when I just got all shook up and the world was falling apart and I was never going to get through this one. Only to discover God had everything under control and was working. There have been times when I've cried and prayed and agonized and fretted and worried, and then finally, right at the last minute, which is plenty good enough, God would come through and answer, and I couldn't really even enjoy the victory because I was so ashamed of the way I'd acted before He came. Sometimes it's ignorance. We just don't understand the situation like God does, and the devil just lets us see certain parts that really make it look very dark and gloomy, but if we could see what God is doing in the background, we'd realize everything's okay. Sometimes we just have problems. We don't have all the facts. I remember a number of years ago in my home city of Spartanburg, South Carolina, they had a little baby born in the hospital. Its whole right side was black. Of course, its whole left side was black too. It was a little colored baby. But you see, you thought we had a problem. You didn't know all the facts. We didn't have a problem. You just didn't know all the facts. I remember one time I was in Georgia trying to pioneer a church. And we had good days and we had bad days, and sometimes we'd have a dozen and sometimes we'd have half a dozen. But it was just that romance of pioneer work, and I was just a young couple with just one little baby, and we went to church one morning and got the church all opened up for Sunday school, and it came Sunday school time, and not a soul came. Now, we'd had slim pickings, but we'd never had nobody before. And after, it's 10 after, they obviously aren't coming. So I said, well, honey, we're not going to let the devil defeat us. Bring that baby up here and lay her on the altar, and we go pray. And so she did, and we did. And I prayed, oh God, nobody loves us. Nobody cares. We work and slave and take them to the doctor and buy their groceries and sweep this church out, and nobody cares, and nobody loves us, and nobody wants the truth. And I really got with it. And when I got done and stood up, the church was full. And one man said, Brother Barr said, we went on daylight savings time at 2 o'clock this morning. You know what my problem was? I'm just ignorant. But in my ignorance, the devil had something to beat me over the head with. And some of you young'uns aren't going to like this, but it can be immaturity. And the fact is that I don't mean that as a put down. We all have growing to do. But sometimes it's just a matter, there are things that God wants to accomplish in your life that are never going to be accomplished at an altar. They're going to be accomplished just by hanging in there and living long enough to learn some things. I remember hearing about a young man, a young farm boy who was courting head over heels in love with the farmer's daughter down the road. And so after a hard day's work, he would get cleaned up and go down there to see his sweetheart. And he would stay just as late as the father's curfew allowed, of course, being very much in love. And the night of this story, he had stayed late, and now it was time to go home, and it was a dark and stormy night. Overcast, no moon. The circuitous country winding road back to his farm was long. He was weary. But there was a shortcut you could take that would cut a big chunk off the trip home. You could follow the railroad track, which cut straight through instead of winding like the road did. The problem with that was that there was a point at which that railroad track went over a deep gorge with a raging river far below on a trestle. And it was dangerous in the daytime. It would be treacherous and dangerous, sure enough, on a dark night like tonight. But he was so tired, and it was so far, and it was so late, till he decided to do it. And so in the dark, almost more by feel than by sight, he found the railroad track, and he began to follow it. And finally, from the sound of the river raging in the darkness far below, he knew he had arrived at the trestle. And so he got down on his hands and knees where he could feel and be careful. And he began to crawl across that railroad track, feeling each tie as he moved along. But tragically, when he realized, assumed that he was about in the middle of the trestle, he heard an awful sound. The sound of a train whistle. And in just a few seconds, around the bend came the sweeping light of an onrushing train. And he began to go as fast as he could, but the train was bearing down upon him, and finally he dared stay on top of the trestle no longer. So he swung down underneath and held onto a cross tie, and the train began to rumble overhead, rattling and shaking, and his grip was giving away, and he prayed for a short train, but it wasn't a short train, it was a long train. And finally he realized he could not hold on any longer, so he cried out to God, committed his soul to the Lord, turned loose, and fell 2 inches to the ground below. Now you know what his problem was? He was 2 inches too short. If he'd have been 2 inches taller, he'd have known that he made it, but he didn't. And so he had a hard time. And I urge you, young people, one of the greatest things you'll ever learn is to just hang in there. I've got a sermon that I won't get to preach in this camp, so I'll give you my outline, 3-point outline. Point number 1, don't quit. Point number 2, don't quit no matter what. Point number 3, no matter what, don't quit. I'm just telling you, young people, if you'll hang in there, listen, if you give up, all the angels in heaven can't help you. But I am convinced that the kind of God we have, if you'll hang on, He will get you through somehow if you won't quit. One of the greatest lessons I ever learned, and I had to learn it because, believe me, it's not my nature, but was to say, don't get off the train while it's going through a tunnel. Hang on, and somewhere you come out on the other side. Don't quit. Talking again about physical, can I give a devil something to beat us with? It can be sickness. We live in temples of clay. The psalmist said in Psalm 103:14, "For He knoweth our frame. He remembereth that we are dust." Was it Shakespeare who said there is no such thing as a philosopher with a toothache? No, but he should have. Okay. And people, when we're sick, we cannot think correctly. And so the devil has a way of beating us over the head. My mother, now you have to understand, my mother is not normally nervous. My mother is abnormally nervous. My mother is a nervous wreck, okay? And I remember we were living in Puerto Rico, and we lived way out in the middle of the country in a Puerto Rican house. And it was, of course, the tropics. And the house had no glass windows, no screens, just shutters you could close for privacy. Open those up, thick walls for hurricane season, and just open to the outside. It hadn't even had any electricity at all until we had agreed to rent it, and so they had put in electricity for us. Electricity consisted of 2 light bulbs. That's it, no plug-ins, just 2 light bulbs hanging down, low wattage light bulbs hanging down. So the house, especially if when you had to close it up, could be pretty dark. My mother had been very ill, seriously ill, life-threateningly ill, and we'd been very concerned. But now it seemed she had turned the corner and passed the crises and was getting better. And my daddy was very encouraged this morning as he realized how much better she was, and he left to go out to the air base to work. And so thus he was all the more alarmed when he came back home that afternoon and found my mother in bed with her head covered up, sobbing uncontrollably. And he rushed over, Lillian, what's wrong? Oh, hey, babe, I'm dying. You're dying. I thought you were doing better. I thought I was too, but I'm dying. I'm going blind. You're going blind? Yeah, I'm going blind. What do you mean you're going blind? So I got up. I did feel better this morning. In fact, I felt so well, I thought maybe I'd get up and clean up a little bit. She said, I got up, went in the bathroom, looked in the mirror. I can't even see my own face. I'm dying. I'm losing. I'm going blind. My daddy said, honey, there isn't any glass in the mirror. I broke it this morning. My mother pulled down the covers and said, you did? You said your mom is nuts. No, my mom is not nuts, but my mom had been sick. And when we're sick, sometimes we cannot think straight. And I am convinced that we have the kind of God that when we can't hold on to Him, He will hold on to us. Many of you older people know that great saint of the Lord, Brother L.W. Barbie. Brother Barbie is sort of my adopted spiritual daddy, and his wife was my spiritual mama. And when Sister Barbie became horribly ill, my wife stopped traveling with me for almost a year to nurse Sister Barbie. And Sister Barbie suffered like I didn't know a human being could suffer. If you knew her, she was a very tall lady. And yet before she died, she weighed 60-something pounds. Weeks before she passed away, I'd go to see her, and you could have just pronounced her dead, and I wouldn't have argued with you. I did not see any signs of life, but the machinery said there was life in there. Sister Barbie had been saved as a very young lady and had lived for the Lord all of her life. But I remember one time in all of that suffering and the heavy medication that they had to give her so that she could even survive the pain. I went in to see her, and she began to sob and cry, and she said, Albert, said, God's gone. God's gone. And I don't know what I've done, but God is gone. And I could not convince her otherwise. And so with a heavy heart, I went home and I went to bed. And people, when I tell you the Lord spoke to me, I do not say that lightly. I could count on one hand the times when I would want to say the Lord spoke to me. Of course, there are those times when you feel sure that you found the mind of the Lord. But I mean where God just almost audibly, not really claiming audible, but that it couldn't be any more real if it had been audible. But this was one of those times. And so at the command of God, I got back up and got dressed, and I went back into the hospital. And I went back into Sister Barbie. And Sister Barbie has known me since I was a very young man. And she knows me. And she knows that that is one of my traits. I do not. I'm very reluctant to make claims like that. But I said, Sister Barbie, I went home and went to bed, and God spoke to me and told me to get up and get dressed and to come back in here and give you a message. And she looked at me intently. He told me to tell you, Sister Barbie, that he's been trying to get through to you. But your sickness and the medication, your mind doesn't seem to be able to comprehend, and you don't seem to be able to hear him. And so he asked me if I would come in and give you the message that he loves you very much. You could see, because she knew that I wasn't playing psychobabble. I don't do that. And she knew that I meant exactly what I said. And you could see her relax and her joy. We don't have a God who abandons us when we need him. I close with this illustration. A number of years ago, I was teaching at Hope Sound, very busy man. Anyone working in a Bible school is not busy, is doing something wrong. It was a time of great stress. I was having some serious problems in my family, and I was struggling in ways that I'd never struggled before with some of these things. And one day in the midst of all that busyness and the tension that I was under, I came to it with a start to the realization that it had been a long time since I had heard from heaven. In fact, when I got to think about it, I could hardly remember the last time that I knew that deep inner, that you've touched God, that he heard your prayers. Oh, I've been going through the motions, but I mean, you know what I mean. And suddenly realizing that, I began to make some adjustments in my priorities and to spend more time in prayer, and then to spend even more, and then to fast and pray, and then to pray through the night with fasting. To my growing alarm, God didn't show. I did everything that I preached then and preach now that you do to bring God on the scene, and God didn't come. Weeks went by. I became desperate, but God wouldn't answer. There has always been one medium that will move me when nothing else reaches my heart, and that's music. And so I began to take every opportunity to put myself under anointed music. And you cannot know the terror, people, the sheer horror that overwhelmed me when I would see other people moved and stirred, and my heart was steel. Nothing moved me. I tried everything repeatedly, and I finally came to the conclusion that I was a backslider, that God was gone, that I was damned, that God would answer me no more. And wanting to at least do the right thing, I began to make the rounds of my boss men. I went to see Dr. Ed Palm, academic dean at the college in those days. I said, Dr. Palm, I need to talk with you. He said, all right. I said, Brother Palm, here I am, a professor in a college, teacher in the high school. Hardly a more awesome undertaking that a man could put himself to than to think he's going to mold the minds of the next generation in the things of God. And yet the fact is, Brother Palm, that I am a backslider. God doesn't hear me when I pray, and I am here to resign. No, you don't understand. Yes, I've done that, Brother Palm. Yes, and that too, and that. Not once, but many times, and God does not hear me. Brother Palm, you may not understand this. I am not here to confess some gross and horrible sin. I've not been unfaithful to my wife. I've not done I said I did get too busy and just kind of let my devotions become perfunctory, but I said I've tried to tell God that 100 times and He won't hear me. I said, you may not understand it, but I'm in a position where I would welcome the revelation of some serious sin if confessing that sin would bring God back on the scene. But I said, God is simply gone. I have grieved Him away. I'm damned, and I am here to resign. And Brother Palm said, Brother Barr, inasmuch as you're not here to confess some gross and horrible sin, why don't we just pray and give God some time? And he prayed for me, but I felt nothing. I went to see Brother Vogel in the print shop. I said, Brother Vogel, I need to meet with you. He said, all right. I said, Brother Vogel, you know that I illustrate most of the literature that goes out from Hope Sound Press. I happen to believe that in almost a mystical way, what you are down inside comes out through your productions of art or music or whatever it may be. But I said, Brother Vogel, there's nothing to come out through me. I'm a backslider. God is gone. He doesn't hear me when I pray anymore. And I'm here to resign. And Brother Vogel said, Brother Barr, why don't we just pray and give God some time? And he prayed for me, but I felt nothing. I went to see Brother French. Brother French, I need to talk with you, all right? Brother French, here I am a member of the board of the church. If anybody in the world needs to be in good victory, it's the members of the board of the church. And yet the fact is, Brother French, that I am a backslider. God doesn't hear me when I pray. I am here to resign. He said, Brother Barr, why don't we pray and give God some time? And he prayed for me, but I felt nothing. I went to see Brother Joe Smith, head of FEA Missions. I said, Brother Joe, I need to meet with you. He said, all right. I said, Brother Joe, here I am a representative for FEA Missions. I travel down through the islands and supposedly preach to the heathen. And then I come back and travel across the country representing those heathen to our people. But the fact is, Brother Joe, that I am worse than any heathen. I'm a backslider. God is gone. He doesn't hear me when I pray, and I am here to resign. And he said, Brother Barr, why don't we just pray and give God some time? And he prayed for me, but I felt nothing. These men and others began to meet with me at night, busy men with heavy loads, but they would take their time to meet with me and pray with me, but God didn't show. The devil began to talk to me about, you know, Barr, you must be one despicable person. I wonder what these preachers say after you leave. Busy men with heavy loads, and here you are, a middle-aged, supposedly evangelist, teacher, preacher, and here you are sniveling around, can't find God. Wonder what they say when you're gone. You must be one disgusting person. Wonder what a wife feels like to have a husband that sits around all day and just cries and cries, and when she says, what's wrong, honey? You say, I don't know. Wonder how children feel to have a daddy that just doesn't function anymore. Nothing wrong with you, Barr, except God's gone, and now you're losing your mind. Because my mind became clouded. I had this feeling that if I could just think deeply enough, if I could get A in front of B, I could arrive at C and I could figure out what was going on, but I couldn't hold a thought long enough to even get it lined up. And the devil said, God's gone, and you're losing your mind. Why don't you do everybody a favor, Barr, and just blow your brains out? And that may sound really silly in this lovely sanctuary with the lights on and the sun shining today. It didn't sound silly in that deep valley. And I must tell you that I am not sure as I look back upon it, but what I might have listened to the voice of the devil. If something else had not happened, my body began to fail me. I couldn't walk across the room without catching my breath. And nothing wrong with you, Barr, but God is gone and you're losing your mind. I had been scheduled for a long time to hold a meeting in Freeport, Grand Bahamas. These men who were praying with me believed that this was all an attack of the enemy, and they had urged me as an act of faith to keep that meeting. I'm not even saying whether that was good advice or not. I'm just telling you what they said. And wanting to cooperate with men who were sacrificing their time to help me, I had reluctantly agreed. But as we grew closer and closer to that meeting, I sank deeper and deeper into the horror of depression, and my body grew weaker. And finally, when I awoke on the morning that midday Mark Vernon was to fly me across to the islands, when I awoke that morning, I could not get out of bed. I tried. I struggled. I simply could not get out of bed. I finally rolled off the edge of the bed and collapsed in a heap on the floor. I crawled on my hands and knees in little spurts, gasping and weeping, to the living room. I tried everything in my power to get my feet under me, and they would not obey. And finally, when I could wait no longer, I reached up and pulled the telephone off of the end table, and I called Brother Smith. And I was sobbing, and I said, Brother Joe, please don't hate me. I know I must be one disgusting, despicable person, but I can't go. And Brother Joe said, that's all right, Brother Barr, and he went in my place, and I hung up the phone and cried. Later that day, my son-in-law, Paul, who was at that time a paramedic, dropped by, took one look at his father-in-law, gathered me up, and rushed me to the hospital. There it was ascertained that I was hemorrhaging internally. The doctor said, Mr. Barr, said, you've been losing blood for a long time. You are seriously anemic. But said something has really let go in the last 24 hours. Said if you had not come into the hospital today, you would have died during the night. We are going to put you in the hospital and find out what's going on, and so they did. And in my depressed state, I assumed the worst. This would be my deathbed. I would never come out of here alive. That night, they gave me 4.5 pints of blood. But do you know, as I lay in that hospital room, and drop by drop, the blood flowed back into my arms, the lights begin to come on, and the clouds begin to lift. And God wasn't gone. He never had been gone. I'd been sick. And the devil took advantage of a body that was weak and a mind that was starved to come and tell me that God didn't love me. Now, people, I'm Wesleyan Arminian. I believe it is possible for someone who has known the Lord to go off into apostasy and insist in their rebellion and ultimately lose their soul. But you do that, you'll work at the job. You'll walk over all the tender mercies of a God who gave His Son to die for you, who wants you to go to heaven, who's done everything in His power to get you there, a God who doesn't run off and abandon His children when we're hurting and we're sick and we're down. The devil is the accuser of the brethren. So you have bad days. And some will be silly bad days, and some will be very, very serious. But they never mean that God does not love us. And if in fact you have a bad day precisely because of rebellion and sin, it is the love of God that makes you unhappy with your rebellion. It is the goodness of God that bringeth us to repentance. It is always His love that we deal with. So you having a bad day today? We've got a good God. Hang in there. The sun will shine again. The stars will flash again. The birds will sing again. God is that kind of God. I go through a lot of long, dry places, but I've learned if I'll hang in there, somewhere on the other side, the God who is faithful and true will come to my rescue. And that if in fact there is a real problem between I and the Lord, me and the Lord, He will move mountains to get the word through to me. And barring that, I can afford to just walk on in faith, knowing that He's that kind of a God.
We're glad you joined us. God's Bible School and College prepares students for lives of ministry wherever God calls them. This content is possible because of the generous support of friends like you. To support GBSC, visit giving.gbs.edu. Thank you.